I'm Nigel Vanderlinden. This is Collaboration is Culture podcast, exploring how we work together and how to make it better. In this episode, I'm joined by Elizabeth Harrin and Anita Phagura to discuss inclusive project meetings. Elizabeth Harrin teaches people how to juggle multiple projects so they can meet stakeholders' expectations without working extra hours. She is a project management practitioner, trainer, mentor, and founders of Rebel's Guide to PM.com. An author of 7 project management books, Elizabeth prides herself on her straight-talking, real-world advice for project managers. She uses her 20 years experience doing the job to help people deliver better quality results while stitching the burnout through her community membership program, Project Management Rebels. Anita Phagura is a skilled inclusion specialist, ICF accredited leadership coach, and master's qualified project manager with over a decade of experience in the male-dominated industry of railway construction. This combination of experience, background, and skills put her in a position where she is able to deliver transformational inclusion outcomes. Using coaching and facilitation skills with a compassionate yet challenging nature, she is able to support leaders to change ways of thinking, upskilling, and understanding of inclusion, and translating this into a courageous action. They are able to embed equitable, inclusive structures to create cultures of belonging. Elizabeth and Anita, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Elizabeth, what does it mean to be inclusive in the context of a project meeting?
I think it's about making sure that you've created an environment where everyone has the opportunity to contribute. And it seems to be something that we need to pay particular attention to now, having gone virtual, because a lot of the technology dictates how we interact with people. And I think if we bear in mind the different needs that people might have when they turn up to our meetings, or the different systems that they're using, as well as how they are and how they want to interact with that software, then we've got to make it easy for them to participate, because we get together for meetings to get an outcome, to get a business decision, to get things moving forward. And if we don't get the inputs from the right people, it slows us down. Maybe we don't make the decision at all. And then that can have implications for, productivity and all those other things. So I think for me, that's the background of why it's important to think about inclusivity when we come to meetings.
And Anita, who are we being inclusive for, or what are we inclusive of?
Yeah, great question. So the way I see inclusion is it is for everybody. However, we really need to be mindful and targeted of the types of groups of people who aren't normally as included, or perhaps by default they would be excluded or left out in some way. So there are some groups that, because of their identity, it doesn't tend to fit what is deemed the majority group or what we might typically associate with in that environment. So those kind of people, so I'm speaking as an example as a woman in a male-dominated environment, but also I think for lots of different identity characteristics who may then be more marginalised because they might not fit what is typically considered. So when we are thinking about inclusive meetings, we need to think about everyone, but we also need to be really targeted about those people who we need to be more specific about, because if we aren't, then they may be excluded by default.
And has the move to remote/hybrid been particularly challenging from an exclusivity perspective for certain groups?
Absolutely, and both sides of this actually. For some groups, it's actually been more positive. So, for instance, we've all got different layers of our identity, and one of my personally is that I'm an introvert. So the traditional meeting structure, I can do well in. However, I also know that for a lot of introverts, sometimes the more hybrid or the virtual working has actually allowed them to contribute more consciously and be more likely to be heard. So, and also, for instance, there's some research that shows that there are some groups who are not as reluctant to go directly back into the office and face-to-face working, and that can include women of colour. And that largely that's because they face less microaggressions in a virtual context than they will in the everyday face-to-face reactions. However, for some of those people and also other groups of people, the virtual working has actually been quite detrimental for them, and they can feel harder to be heard and be included. So it's not every environment suits every type of person.
Elizabeth, what's your perspective?
I think that's...
Elizabeth, what's your perspective?
I think what Anita said is absolutely true. And with the vast groups of people that we work with and the diversity of our colleagues, we need to be conscious of the fact that people's needs are different and leverage technology where it makes sense to do so, and offer people multiple different ways to engage with whatever it was that we need to come together to discuss. And your example there, Anita, made me think of an example that happened to me. I'm quite used to having to change up my teaching methods when I'm delivering courses depending on who's in the room, but tech has made it easier for me to do that for certain groups of people. And for example, one course I taught a couple of years ago, it made it possible for a deaf student to participate in the short course because she got in touch in advance and asked whether I could make those changes to the way Zoom was set up to add captions, whether we'd be able to have a transcript of the meeting afterwards. And of course, that's something that's actually really straightforward to do. But she had to reach out to me to ask that. I didn't ask beforehand, would any of the delegates have anything that they wanted to share with me that might make it possible for me to make that meeting more accessible, more inclusive, more representative of the people that were there. So the learning for me was really that I should be reaching out and asking, especially if there's people in the room, the virtual room, that I don't know, haven't worked with before, but also that the tech made it possible for her to participate in a way that perhaps she wouldn't have been able to if I couldn't switch on the captions. So tech gives us lots of advantages, I think, in some spaces, but I agree with what you said, Anita, it doesn't work for everybody.
That's a great illustration of one of the benefits of inclusive project meetings. Maybe that's where I'll start my next question is, what is the importance of inclusive project meetings? What are the benefits? How does it better serve the project and the business?
I'll jump in from times that I haven't felt included and what then I felt I've personally lost from that situation, and also what the project is losing by me not being able to contribute as fully as I could have done or wanted to. So I've got a few examples from my project management career in the railway. And there are absolutely meetings that were amazing, right? But there are also those meetings where I felt actually quite small, and I've got examples where I was shushed in a meeting. I've got examples where
Wow.
Yeah, so that's one example. I've got examples where I felt like I was laughed at in a meeting because when I was expressing my point, it was belittled. And another example was when I was contributing a point, which was to the conversation that was happening in the room, and I was talked over, and that and essentially it took about 20 minutes for the person to say, well, actually, let me rephrase that. It took about 20 minutes of the meeting going round in circles and me feeling like I was expressing a solution to a problem we were facing, and it took somebody else in that meeting actually, who then did finally make me feel included by bringing home to say, well, Anita's already given us a solution, let's go forward with that. And however, it took me feeling quite small of me having felt like I said that 3 times and then being ignored. So for me personally, eventually actually this was all from one project environment, so we can see that it was probably a bit toxic. And I wasn't the only one going through these kind of experiences. And ultimately, I left that project environment because I didn't feel valued. Even when those examples happened, I spoke to the people outside of that room and explained how I felt. But ultimately, I was trying to come to work and I was hired to give value, and I wasn't able to do that. I was stifled. And also I witnessed other people going through similar things. So when we are not including people, we are excluding them. We are missing out on those valuable contributions and insights, but also denting their morale and engagement. And in this case, I left. So the project lost out on my motivation, me wanting to do great things for the projects, but also not hearing my ideas. So absolutely, the benefits of inclusion are that we don't fall into that trap. And we have so many meetings, and we don't always need as many, but we're having meetings, as Elizabeth said, for a purpose. Well, we should be. So let's make the most of the people in the room and being able to move those outcomes that we want to get by including the right people in the room and actually having their contributions matter.
And you were one person in that room that felt that way. I would believe that there was likely more in the room that felt that way. So not only were they missing out on your contributions, but the contributions of likely many others, that in some way did not feel included or were not included. Elizabeth, what have you seen in your own practice?
I wonder if technology is giving us a way around that, because I've certainly felt that I've been talked over and ignored in meetings as well. But technology and being able to raise your hand on Microsoft Teams has given a good facilitator the tools to be able to make sure that people don't get talked over. And in my experience, turn-taking in meetings tends to be better in a virtual environment than it is when you're actually meeting in the same room. But I think the thing that jumps out at me from what Anita just shared is that people are leaving. And this is something I hear time and time again. I did a survey for my last book. It was about managing multiple projects, and I got loads of research back. I was expecting it to be all about the juggle and how people are trying to proactively manage their time and all that. And honestly, the verbatim remarks were heartbreaking, because it was all about stress and how awful the job was and how nobody listens and how the managers just keep layering on stuff. I think there's a bit of a crisis in project management, to be honest, in perhaps in more professional fields, because it's such a job that it's a very demanding job. And if we create environments where we are literally toxic, even just not a very welcoming environment, it's a great marketplace at the moment. There's a lot of work happening, not a lot of projects being advertised, a lot of jobs out there. People can leave, and they do, and they are. And as your organisation is losing good talent, and you're losing knowledge walking out the door, because people don't want to work with rubbish managers, and they don't have to. So I think, we're either losing people out of project management because they're choosing to go completely, or good project teams or organisations are losing good project teams, good project managers, because they're choosing to go somewhere that values them. I think that's a real risk for us as a profession in the next 10 years, and creating an inclusive environment that works for everyone and where it's fun to show up to work and where you know that you can contribute and that people are just friendly. And inclusion goes beyond friendliness, obviously, but it's not unusual. It's not unusual for you to ask for things, or for somebody to actually have a time plan for a meeting, because that might help some of the neurodiverse members of the team. And that's something I learned when I was doing research, is that actually there are multiple ways that we can present information in a way that suits all the different brains and people who we work with. Is that appropriate to say? Can I say it suits different people's brains?
I think so.
I'm looking at Anita because she knows everything. She's nodding. So.
We all have different brains. All good.
Okay.
I do appreciate your perspective on stress, because I think it perhaps wasn't one I considered in the context of inclusivity, but it holds true. If the environment is indeed so stressful, not only, I think, is there a risk of people shutting down and not contributing, although still invited, there is the risk of them not coming to the party altogether, right? They're leaving, they're finding another party to go to, as the case may be.
I think that shows up in different things as well. I mean, I have family members with dyslexia, and a lot of computer-mediated technology now relies on us being able to write. Touch type, for example, and to get your words out quickly on a screen. And that, whether that's Slack or Teams chats or sending people messages while you're in a meeting, there are barriers to being able to participate in that way. And I wonder how many people just choose to opt out because it's easier not to, or they feel that under stress because they've got to get their message out quickly, or because work takes them longer because those provisions aren't made for them. Absolutely.
I wonder if, either as a project manager or as a participant, if there's warning signs. In other words, if we're in a project meeting, how would we know if it's not necessarily included, or rather, if it's not necessarily inclusive? Are there red flags? Are there symptoms, etc., that we should be mindful of, that when we see, it's a trigger for us to remember that we've not created an inclusive project meeting?
I think Elizabeth kind of touched on it earlier about actually virtual gives us the ability, or tends to be, that it's more evenly spread in terms of who people are contributing, or it's more visible at least. So I think that is one way that we can be mindful, and it's kind of an obvious way, isn't it, that if somebody's taken up all of the airtime, then are other people perhaps have got something to say or able to contribute and can't because they can't get a word in edgeways, or are just sitting back because somebody else is doing the speaking. So I think that's one way we can be really mindful of that. But we can also create ways that means that actually we can minimise that as a thing that happens by creating ways where we can all contribute. And sometimes that is, we're using the chat function, and I know sometimes my brain might be that I'm still processing something, but somebody's talking, so actually I can maybe use the chat function to get out what I want to say without taking up necessarily the airtime. So we can use the tools that are available to help us do that, or it might be that we have used the breakout rooms and we have actually smaller conversations, then come back together. So there are some solutions, but I think one of the things is around people being able to contribute. I think there are also some indicators that we might not know in the meeting if we're not mindful of it. So actually it's that prep piece before the meeting and also after, and if we're having a series of meetings, so that we are creating that environment where people can share with us. And as Elizabeth said, she had the example where somebody had accessibility needs that was then able to come to her and say, this would help me participate fully. And as a learning, Elizabeth has shared that actually now she has learned from that, so she may well ask that question to her participants in the future. So I think that's something we can do, is we can ask, and we can set clear agendas. We spoke about time plans. Some people don't do as well with spontaneity, so actually having that clearer agenda. And sometimes for some people with neurodiversity, they might be, if they know, for instance, the order that people are meant to or are going to speak in, then that can help gear them up for when they're going to speak. So we can find, I suppose, tools and techniques that work in different groups, but actually we can also ask the people that we're working with, and use virtual collaboration tools as well. That means that everybody can participate at the same time.
Thank you, Anita. Elizabeth, I wonder if there's any red flags or warnings in the project results. I'm hypothesizing here, but maybe it was a key requirement that was missed, or a risk that wasn't identified. Is there any indicators in project results that a project management meeting or team was lacking inclusivity?
Potentially. I mean, that does feel a little bit like I'm probably need to take that away and reflect. But my initial thoughts would be yes. Certainly one of the signs could be risks are missed because we're not listening to the people who are raising those things. The wrong decision is taken because we're not listening to a broad spectrum of people, we're not getting broad input into solution design. So we're actually creating something that isn't really fit for purpose. So there could be issues that come out along the way. I think the biggest risk for me, the biggest red flag, is participation just dropping. Engagement drops. People don't want to work for project teams or for projects where they don't feel that they're valued and where they don't feel that they're heard. So ultimately, an individual may well just step back because they've got other things, other pressing engagements to do, other work that is easier or more valued or that feels more aligned to how they want to work, and working with us is difficult. So they might do it, but they're probably not going to give 110%, not even maybe 100% to our project, and that would show up in ability to hit deadlines, the quality of their work, and that might be a red flag.
Absolutely. Anita, in the example that you provided earlier, in particular about your own experience with a toxic project or a project for which you were excluded, there were two things I picked up on. One is you had someone advocate on your behalf, and you also advocated yourself. That prompts my next question is, who's responsible for creating inclusive project meetings?
Oh, that's a great question. I think we all are, right? If we're going to show up to a meeting, I think we all are. However, I think the person who takes the responsibility is the one who set up the meeting. You're the one who put the agenda together. You may or may not be chairing, but you're the one who identified the need for a meeting. You're the one who identified the need for the meeting. You're the one, perhaps by yourself or with your team, identified who should come to the meeting. So I think ultimately that person is the one responsible for making that environment inclusive. However, when we are in the environment, we can also play a part in making sure our colleagues are included and heard. And that can be when we're seeing somebody not being included or being as heard, then what can we do to advocate for them, with them?
And question to you both, I mean, how do you then make it everyone's responsibility?
Well, I learned a good phrase the other day, which was take space, make space. And another facilitator shared that with me. I'd not heard that before. But I think in terms of ground rules, which I know is a bit of a corporate buzzword, and perhaps it's not the right thing to say, let's create ground rules whenever you go into a meeting. But within your organisational culture or your team culture or even your project team, you can talk about these things. You can say we want everybody to be able to participate, and this is what it looks like when we all show up. And I really like the idea of take space and make space. So we're taking the space that we need for our own ideas, but we're also making space for other people to step up and contribute and be heard as well.
Oh, I really like that. And that's a great segue really into perhaps a focused discussion on tactics. I mean, how do we create inclusive project meetings? I know we've peppered the conversation somewhat with some suggestions, but what conditions must be present to have an inclusive project meeting, and how do we create those conditions with various tactics, tools, or otherwise?
So I think one of the things that we need to recognise in our project environments is that we have different levels of power and privilege, and there is a societal elements of that means that some groups are more likely to be heard in those environments, but also in what it could be the hierarchy in the project, or even sometimes not hierarchy, but there are some political factors that mean that some people are more well respected or more likely to be heard, or they have more power in whatever sense. So I think that's something that we need to recognise, and actually in our meetings we need to try and find a way of making it a bit more power balanced. And so some of that might be with the ground rules, as Elizabeth said, and I think actually those boundaries are really important. So we're clear about what is okay, what isn't okay, how do we expect to treat each other. So I think that can be the elephant in the room if we don't address it. And I used to work in an organisation, and they had a phrase which actually was part of essentially like their values, and then at a time then that phrase changed, and I really felt the loss of that phrase. And it was just that everyone's time is important, and for me what I took away from that is we are all important, our contributions all mattered, and so I think something as simple as that, and then if people then live by it, can be really powerful.
I like that. The first step is acknowledgement, getting in fact an understanding of the dynamics in the room, be it real or virtual, and that could be power balance, that could be hierarchy, roles, positions, gender, race, ethnicity, needs as the case may be, and so on. Great suggestion, Anita.
We had
Elizabeth.
that on one of our projects, found that the meetings seemed to be dominated by our very charismatic and experienced and well-respected project sponsor, who unfortunately was not as connected to the detail of the business processes as the people who were actually doing the business processes. And so, as well as we recognised the power dynamic and the fact that people didn't want to speak up when he was there, so we didn't invite him to any of the others. So in terms of tactics, one way would be look at who's in your room. Do they need to be there? How do you address that power balance? Maybe you have smaller meetings or different structure to the meetings. And something Anita touched on earlier is making sure that people are clear about what's going to happen. So if you want a particular person to present a business process, that they are prepared to do that. They know they're going to be asked to do that. You don't spring it on them, so they're not worried, or they've had enough time to reflect and prepare. And that sets the tone for everybody in the room to say, actually, we've got this person leading this section. This is going to be a free discussion where we're all going to contribute. So, we're expecting to hear all the voices, and you lay out an agenda and a time plan, and you can distribute materials in advance to help people understand what they're walking into when they show up to the meeting.
Excellent suggestions. What I also heard from both of you over the course of the conversation is to also provide your participants with options. In other words, that there is more than one way for them to contribute. So that, in fact, may be in a synchronous meeting, or it may be in a chat, I believe you said, Anita. But giving them a broad set of options that, let's say, may align best with their differences, be it work style, work preferences, technology comfort, race, ethnicity, or otherwise. In the circumstance that we are involved in a project that is not inclusive and, heaven forbid, is toxic in terms of its environment, is there an opportunity to course correct, and how do we go about advocating for that?
So I think absolutely there's always an opportunity to course correct. However, it does need a mass of willingness to do it, and I think it does depend on where that is coming from, that desire. I think we are still in the hierarchy and those positions where some people have more power and privilege. If it's coming from those people, it can be really effective. I think as a single person who is feeling the brunt of a toxic environment, or several people, then that can be challenging to then change that environment. However, if you realise that actually you're not the only one going through it, and there is therefore a mass of people going through it, what can you do to come together and actually advocate for change so that you can then influence, essentially top up? For a single person, I actually think it's very, very difficult, one or two people, from my experiences, and also other people that I've coached and mentored, because we can feel like actually it's on us to change a whole environment, and we will bear the brunt of that when we're already stressed by the day job and already stressed by the experiences we're going through. So we can try and get those allies on our side and try and create change by creating more of a mass. So I think it's then definitely possible. And actually, like we've touched on earlier, if you're the one setting up the meeting, you're the one essentially with some power in that situation. What can you do to create a more equitable structure so that those people who aren't being heard are more likely to be heard?
Anything to add, Elizabeth?
I think I agree with Anita. It's difficult to change things if you're a single person, but the thing that changes it most is being brave, in my experience anyway, and being prepared to say, this isn't working for me, or if we did things this way, this would be better. And that's such a hard thing to do. And, you know, I can think of only a few small examples of where I've had to do that. Nothing like the environment that you were describing earlier, Anita, but working in IT in a mainly, you know, in a mixed environment, but with a male boss and male colleagues at my level. As a breastfeeding mother, they had literally no idea what that was like to go to a meeting. We went to an off-site meeting and they said, well, you know, you can express milk in the toilets. Well, yeah, but no. And I think being able to have a conversation around actually that makes me feel like this, and I would prefer it if we could do that, and just seeing the scales fall from their eyes and think, oh, okay, now I understand it from somebody else's perspective. And if they understand, or at least if they can listen to your perspective of where you're coming from, they can help advocate on your behalf and make those small changes. So in my experience, speaking up, I think, is a good thing, but I acknowledge that there is a certain privilege with that, and not everybody is able to have those conversations.
Wonderful suggestions, Elizabeth and Anita. Elizabeth and Anita, how can the listeners stay connected with you?
Probably the easiest way to stay connected with me is to connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find me, I'm Elizabeth Harrin, or you can get in touch through our Facebook group, which is Project Management Cafe.
You will most likely find me lurking or saying something on LinkedIn, so that's definitely the best place to connect with me. I'm Anita Phagura, it's spelled with a PH, and you'll find it in the show notes.
I truly enjoyed my conversation with both of you and learned so much. Thank you for joining and contributing to the conversation of how to create inclusive project meetings. I very much appreciate it.